All right, a couple of questions from this last Sunday. The first question is, I was trying to think if it's related directly to the sermon. Maybe not, that's okay. I like any questions, they're all good. The question is a human dichotomous or trichotomous? Or said differently, is a human being made up of a body and a soul, or a body, soul, and spirit? Does the Bible distinguish between soul and spirit, or are soul and spirit synonymous or interchangeable? And this is debated. My brother, who's a pastor down in Austin, just finished his D-Min writing on pastoral counseling in light of the trichotomous nature of humans. Ironically, his brother, me, here in Grand Prairie, doesn't believe in the trichotomy of the human being. So there we go. I think Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12, it says in the Word, it talks about in the Word is living and active like a two-edged sword, able to divide the difference between soul and spirit. And then he gives the parallel, separating bone from marrow. And from my perspective, this means bone and marrow. Bone is the larger, and marrow is a subset or a part of the bone. That the writer there may have that distinction. And so I've kind of held to the idea that humans are a body and a soul, and that the spirit is a subset of the soul. So the spirit resides within the soul. So all people have souls, but not all people's spirit are alive. People are spiritually dead or spiritually alive, which is why you can speak of a spiritually dead person committing sin. Remember how Paul says in Ephesians 2:1, and you were dead in your trespasses and sins. You go, well, if they're dead, how could they be sinning? The answer is the soul is alive, but the spirit is dead. The soul is alive at least in terms of making moral choices. And so I think the humans are dichotomous, that they are made up of a body and a soul, and that the soul is also has within the soul, you have emotions and motives and feelings, these kinds of things, but you also have the spiritual aspect of the soul. And so there's a subset of the soul within the non-physical aspect of the human. Okay, second question has to do with the translation choice on Sunday morning for 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Some of the translations put the word betrothed, and the NASB uses his virgin daughter. And so the question is, why did you pick that one versus another? And the answer is this. First of all, is all of the translators have a problem here, because the normal language for his virgin and let them be married, the normal language there is normally used of reference between a father and his virgin daughter's relationship. And so some people have said, well, this is Paul giving permission for dads to marry their own virgin daughters, let them be married. Clearly that's not what Paul's saying, because he just got through in the chapter before castigating someone who's married his father's wife. So I can't imagine that being the case. Others have said this is some kind of spiritual marriage that the Corinthian church practiced between fathers and daughters, but there's no evidence for that. And it clearly does look like a real marriage, because the very next two verses talk about a lady whose husband dies, and she's also free to marry. So that doesn't make any sense. Well, what ESV and some of the other translators have done is just said, well, his virgin must be talking about a guy who's engaged to someone to get married. The problem is this is someone coming of age, and normally you wouldn't speak of a arranged marriage like that, of a daughter who's just now coming of age, as belonging in that kind of possessive way to her future spouse. And so I took the approach that the NASB did here, and there's several reasons. Number one, very simply, Paul's already told them that if you're not yet married, you can get married. He's already said that up above. So why in the world would he re-give permission for it down here? Clearly, if he gives permission to single people, hey, you want to get married? Get married. Why would he then need to clarify that for someone who's engaged but not yet married? That would be strange to me. Secondly, is that he then, the next two verses within context, says that he's talking to a lady who's married and her husband dies. Well, she doesn't need parental permission because she's emancipated now. Once a lady is married, she now no longer belongs to her father. She's no longer under the authority of her father. She is instead emancipated. And so she is free to get married, and there she doesn't need the permission of a dad. She wouldn't get one anyway. Someone also asked me, says, seems like you're talking about Corinth, where this is more a Jewish tradition that the fathers have control over daughters. But you've got to remember, I think the Corinthian church has a very strong Jewish audience. Remember, just above in this very same chapter, he says, if you're circumcised, then great, but if you're not, then don't go get circumcised. Clearly, Jewish circumcision is playing a huge role within the church, so Judaism is playing a role. So I do think it's very possible that you have dads giving permissions to daughters to get married. Now here's the challenge on the NASB's translation, is that if that's correct, what's going on is that let them get married. Some people said this is the dad to the daughter. I think the them is reference to the unspoken groom that will one day enter this particular picture, just like the unspoken groom for the lady mentioned the very next verse who says if her husband dies, she's free to remarry to whomever she chooses. The whomever for the daughter of this man. Now, that being said, in light of the fact that it's a bit of a disputed text and how we understand it, if we had the questions from the Corinthian church, this wouldn't be an issue for us. So we're having to figure out what their question would be. Paul doesn't explain it because he's writing to them on questions they've asked him. So they're not going to go, oh, I wonder what he's talking about. They know exactly what he's talking about. And it's for us in the 21st century to try to look back and figure out what's the best translation of that. That being said, one of the reasons on Sunday morning I didn't spend a ton of time on the text themselves is because it's a wisdom literature situation where Paul says, I'm just giving you wisdom here. I'm giving you some wise advice. So I slid into this notion of dads giving away daughters in marriage and what kinds of spouse both daughters and sons should be looking for, the interaction between parents and kids on this. But the reality is most of the wisdom things that I use from the scripture would apply if you were engaged to someone, getting engaged to someone, those kinds of things. So I went broad application wisdom, and I think the NASB has it correct in light of the context of the entire chapter. I didn't want to hash all those technical things out on a Sunday morning. That by the time you're done, you've spent 30 minutes and people walk out of here, I think, going, okay, well, I may agree or disagree, but why did we spend 30 minutes on such a technical thing on 2 verses? And so that's the approach I took. Right or wrong, that's the approach I took. But I had a few people ask me about that. Their translations say betrothed. My translation says his virgin daughter. And the reason I went with NASB is because I think that's the right interpretation in light of the context of the entire chapter. So anyway, those are good questions. We will see you guys this Sunday.